Hey guys, how's it going? This is Leo here, also known as Leomane. If you've seen any of my other videos, I recommend you watch this one first, because I'm going to talk a bit more about the basics of the game, okay? These are terms I'm going to use a lot. For those who don't know me, I've been playing card games for a long time. I don't know, more than 15 years or so. I'm 27 now, and I started playing when I was 12 or 13. Anyway, I used to be one of the best Hearthstone players in Latin America, in Brazil. I've won a championship in Korea, traveled to the United States, and played for a lot of teams like Red Cannons, and so on. I've had a really good career in Hearthstone, and I also did really well in other games like Legends of Runeterra. I think Hearthstone is especially relevant here because we're talking about parallel, right? Which is basically very similar to Hearthstone. The main difference is just the mechanic where you draw two cards, one at the start and one at the end of your turn, and you have to play cards to turn them into mana. Yeah, aside from that, it's basically the same game, right? You choose which creature you're going to attack with. You have 30 health. The heroes are a little different too, but that's about it, okay? So, the goal of this video is to talk about the terms used and, in general, what's important for you to think about when you start playing a game of parallel. Basically, these terms here, these concepts work for any card game, okay? And sometimes even for other games too, alright? A lot of times you'll even see, like Dota or League of Legends coaches playing card games because many of the concepts apply to any game. It's a lot of game theory, right? Anyway, let's get to what matters. The most important thing, okay, is the win condition, alright? In any game, whether it's League of Legends or Dota, unless you usually play CS, you're going in with a plan to win, or at least you should be. If you play just for fun, maybe you don't think about this much, but when you get into the game, you're supposed to have a plan to win. In card games where you build your deck before playing, you usually already have an idea of how your deck is going to win that match, right? Yeah, usually it involves taking your opponent's life from 30 to 0, but there are lots of ways to do that, right? Maybe you try to do that by turn 5 with a deck full of low-cost creatures, so you hit your opponent a lot and then play direct damage cards. Or there might be strategies where you actually try to do the opposite. Stall your opponent as much as possible, avoid losing, so that eventually you can get to your deck's win condition, whether that's pulling off a combo with cards that have a lot of synergy and generate a ton of value, or just stalling until the end and winning because you have more powerful, higher cost cards that let you win, right? So, the most important thing when you start the game is to know what your win condition is. Yeah, that usually involves knowing your opponent's deck, but since we're at a more introductory level here, sometimes you don't even need to, okay? So, for example, if you have a clone deck, you're going into the game knowing that you'll want to play fast cards, low-cost creatures, yeah, control the board both in the foreground and background, and it's really important to attack your opponent before they can execute their own plan, okay? This really depends on the style of your deck, which, by the way, we're going to talk more about here. But knowing what your win condition is will determine what you need to do, and it will help you make more informed decisions so you can win the game. What does that mean? Oh, I drew an opening hand with 4 1-cost cards. Which one should I keep? It depends. What's the matchup? Do you expect your opponent to play a lot of cards early in the game? Then keep all of them. If your opponent's deck is more control-oriented, then you won't necessarily need so many 1-cost cards. You'd rather curve out, so you can keep just a few. So which ones? All of this will be determined based on how you think you're going to win, okay? So knowing which deck you're playing, and the other videos I'm going to make talking about the decks. They're really reviews of the deck, explaining the strategy behind the mulligan. And that's what it's about, because you need to have an idea of what you're doing when you go into the game, okay? From here, I'm going to tell you more or less what the typical deck formats are, alright? Of course, each deck does something different. Oh, I forgot to add, like combo, right? But in general, these are these here are the main 3 types of decks that exist, okay? When you pick a deck, you need to know what it's trying to do so your choices line up with that, and that will give you a better chance of winning the game, right? Let's start with the most common one, and I think maybe even the easiest to play at a more basic level, which are aggro decks, the faster decks. And there's a magic article that's already considered literature in game theory, called Who is the Beatdown, which is basically about who is the aggressor, roughly translated into Portuguese. It was written, I think, in 1909 by Michael Flores, who's a Magic player. Who is the Beatdown is an article that talks about this isn't just in card games, but maybe it's easier to notice in card games. But in any game, there's always an aggressor, and there's always someone who is trying to defend against the aggressor. What does it mean to be the aggressor? If you're the aggressor, it means you're trying to win the game as quickly as possible before your opponent can execute their plan and become the aggressor. Basically, in every game there's always going to be one person who's the aggressor and the other who's the defender, just to put it simply. And this holds true even in a game where both players are playing aggressive decks. If it's, for example, a mirror match of Clone, which is a pretty aggressive parallel deck, one of the two players should actually be playing as the defender, because that would give them a better chance of winning the match, okay? Being the defender isn't necessarily a bad thing, okay? The thing is, when you're in a game, sometimes you don't have perfect information and you might misinterpret your role, whether you're supposed to be the aggressor or the defender, okay? And that can cause you to lose the game, and it most likely will. Being able to identify your role is extremely important, so you can make the right decisions. What does it mean to be the aggressor, okay? Being the aggressor is usually the person who has less card advantage, less value. What does that mean? Usually, the person who has fewer cards in hand and the opponent has more cards in hand means that you've already done more things. So that means that, in the long run, you're going to lose the game because you've already used your resources to play more cards than your opponent, and he still has more cards. It means that if he has more resources or more time, he'll be able to play those cards and match your value, and eventually surpass you and become the aggressor. Okay, what does that mean? If you're the aggressor in this situation, you want to win a game before the other guy can execute his plan, okay, and turn things around. You have that sense of urgency. Usually, the aggressor is also the one who has more pressure on the board. A lot of these things are important for you to be able to identify who the aggressor is. For example, against a combo deck, you're almost always going to be the aggressor because the other guy is just sitting there putting together piece by piece to eventually do something really powerful and beat you. So usually, even if your deck is, say, control, you're trying to be the aggressor against the combo deck because they're just stalling until they can pull off their thing. And even if you're playing control, you'll end up losing. What do these concepts mean in this context? Okay. A control deck is usually a deck that has a lot of high-cost cards, cards that deal damage to everything, creature removal, and not many proactive cards. Usually, the cards are very reactive. For example, 1 mana to deal 2 damage to a creature, for mana to destroy an opponent's 2 mana creature. You're not going to get ahead by playing a 4 mana 2 house that kills one of your opponent's creatures. Usually, you get ahead in the game when you play a 2 mana 2/3, a 1 mana 2 house, playing several creatures that put you in the lead. But even if you have a control deck that can't do that very well, sometimes your opponent's combo deck doesn't have any cards that cost 2 mana or less. So you'll need to play a 4 mana 2 house that kills a creature costing 2 or less without targeting, because you're the aggressor, you know? Yeah, being aware of this will give you a big advantage when it comes to actually playing the game. Sometimes what I'm saying might sound really theoretical, okay? But I ask that you try to take this in, because it's going to give you a huge advantage. Knowing how to identify your role will help you, okay? But now I'm going to talk about the archetypes here. Like I said, aggro is usually the one taking on the role of the aggressor in the match, because it puts itself in that position by using a lot of low-cost cards, while other decks usually have a curve that looks something like this, right? Here, there will be some low-cost cards, but there will also be high-cost cards, not aggro. Very rarely will it have cards that cost more than 6, 7, or 8, and even then, it's just 1, 2, maybe 3 cards. That's because it wants to have a very consistent game plan in the early game to win by being the aggressor as quickly as possible. This is a deck that can really handle the aggressor role well. Next, I'm going to talk about control, which is a deck that behaves differently. It has low-cost cards, but that's not the main focus of the deck. Its focus is, I have cards that, in the long run, I'll be able to play, and they're really powerful, okay? For example, we have cards like the Haystack deck. Costs 8, comes in, does everything. Hair, beard, and mustache, and wins. So you're trying to stall until you reach turn 8, which isn't very easy against an aggressive deck, but all the cards in your deck are there to help you make it that far. Yeah, so the control deck is usually playing as the defender when it comes to interpreting roles, until eventually it manages to overpower the resources and become the aggressor, okay? The aggressor doesn't always have to fight from behind. Sometimes the aggressor is actually ahead, okay? Sometimes you completely controlled your opponent, they have no cards in hand, and you have to take on the role of the aggressor, which means now I'm going to stop being so conservative with my resources and use them to finish the game as quickly as possible before they can draw something and get lucky, like, oh, deal 10 damage to your face and end the game. Next, we have mid-range, okay? So what are mid-range decks? Mid-range decks are the ones that can take on both roles pretty well, alright? And how do they manage to play this role well, but not as well as aggro? They have low cost and proactive cards, but not so much that it stops them from being able to take on the control role decently too. And how does it manage to play control? A control deck usually has a lot of high cost cards, along with some low cost cards to help stall until then, but most of its cards give it a lot of value at higher costs. And the mid-range deck can take on this role because it does something more balanced. It has cards that allow it to play both roles. That means it will have cards that are very efficient, like a 2-cost card that's a 2/3, or a 1-cost card that deals 2 damage to a creature. These cards work in any situation, because they'll help you both against an aggro deck to remove threats, and to be proactive against a control deck. A 1-cost card that deals 2 damage won't be as good against control, because there won't be as many targets, since control decks don't have that many low-cost creatures, but it will be really good against aggro. And against control, the proactive cards will be better, but they won't be as good against aggro decks, because you'll usually be behind. Does that make sense? That's basically it. The mid-range deck is able to take on both roles better than an aggro deck trying to play control. Yeah, but then you might ask, but why is it good to build a mid-range deck if it only does okay at the things other decks do better? Because being able to play that role and do it well puts you in a much better position than if you're playing aggro and have to be the control. If you can't do it well, you'll probably lose that match. You did it? That's why mid-range decks work so well. And just to be clear, I'm talking about this in a vacuum, without considering the metagame, okay? For example, imagine there's a card that, I don't know, costs 1 and destroys all creatures. Control decks would be really strong, because you wouldn't be able to play an aggressive strategy, right? When you have a metagame and people start reaching a consensus. I don't know if you played other card games or watched them, but usually, when there's an archetype that's the strongest, it's mostly because of the metagame, because of which cards are available in that format. So, that's one of the things that will determine what type of deck is the strongest in that game. But in a vacuum, it's basically like I said. The winner is the one who knows what their role is and can execute that role in the best way possible, okay? But if you're playing an aggro deck and you try to take on the control role, you won't be able to do it well, and you'll probably lose. And it's the same thing for the control deck. The opposite is true. Lastly, we have the combo deck, which is probably going to be the one getting beaten up by all the other types. But it has some card combination that will either win the game instantly. Like, for example, Channel Fireball in Magic, right? You go there, boom, win the game, it's over. But in fairer games like Hearthstone and Parallel, it's a bit more like, oh, I managed to pull off this combo of 2, sometimes 3 cards, which gives you a really strong advantage. But without that combo, your deck doesn't do much. So what you're trying to do is stall until you can reach that point to get that advantage, okay? Everything else pretty much revolves around this, alright? This is the framework we're going to try to work with. Now I'm going to talk about these concepts here, okay? What is card advantage, which I'll be talking about in the videos. Card advantage is having more cards, alright? It means you have more cards than your opponent. Generally, how does the game work, right? You're going to. The value of a card is broken down in a certain way. The card itself is valued just by being a card, because you draw 1 each turn, and its value, like why is one creature a 1 cost, a 2 cost, a 2/3, and another is a 4 cost, a 4/5. Why is one better than the other? Usually, the math behind these games, the logic is very similar to Hearthstone, so I'll talk about Hearthstone since that's what I know. The value is basically the mana cost times 2 plus 1, and that's how much you can distribute among the stats. So for a 2-cost card, 2 times 2 is 4, plus 1 is 5. So you can make a creature that's either a 1/4 or a 2/3 or a 3/2. That's kind of the average, okay? There are some creatures that are above the curve, and those are usually the stronger ones. Sometimes the effects don't match up with this formula either. So how does card advantage work? When you play a creature that costs 2 mana and is a 2/3, and your opponent played 2 creatures that each cost 1 mana and are 2/2 S, you can attack your 2 of 3 into one of their 2/2s. Yours survives, and then you can take out the other one. You traded 1 card for 2. That puts you ahead because, on average, cards trade 1 for 1. You can play a 1 mana card that deals 2 damage and kill a creature your opponent controls that has 2 life, right? So, generally, of course, as cards have a higher mana cost, they tend to give you more value. But in general, you're trying to trade 1 for 1 and get a little advantage, because eventually your opponent will have fewer cards than you. And with that, yeah, with more value than your opponent, with those extra cards, you can win, okay? So these trades you make, like how you manage to do things in a way that leaves you with more cards in hand, will give you a big advantage to help you win the game. In other words, I have a 2/3 creature, the guy has a 2/2, and he has a 30 life. What should I do? Do I attack his face or do I attack his creature? Attacking the creature is usually much better. This will also tie into board control later on. But another situation is, like I have a 2/2 creature, my opponent has a 3/2 and a 1/1. Which one do I attack? Well, if you attack the 1/1 and then you can attack the 3/2 afterward, you manage to take out the 1/1 for free, compared to if you just attack the 3/2 first, right? Yeah, so that's going to give you an advantage because your other cards later won't have to deal with that 1/1 that you would have had to handle if you attacked the 3/2 first. Does that mean it's always better to have a 2/2 attack a 1/1 first? No, it depends on the situation. But if you can attack the 1/1 and then the 3/2, and you get that card advantage, in the games where you manage to do that, you'll have a higher chance of winning, okay? Yeah, getting card advantage that way. Other, clearer examples are like, for instance, an 8-cost card that destroys everything. If your opponent puts 3 creatures on the board and you use 1 card to kill all 3, he probably, if you guys are making those normal trades, which are 1 for 1, you'll end up with 2 more cards than him because you did a 3 for 1, right? So that's really good. Usually, you're looking for ways to get card advantage, okay? So that's basically it. It's not that cards that don't give you card advantage, like a 1-cost card that deals 2 damage, are bad. In reality, they're really good because of their versatility and the tempo they give you in the game, right? That control and all. But in general, decks will pick one of these ways to try to win the game, okay? Usually, aggro decks will try to go for board control. Control decks will try to get card advantage, while sometimes aggro will also make a lot of use of tempo. Anyway, mana advantage is something that all decks generally try to achieve, but I'll explain that in more detail later. But card advantage is basically that, making your cards more efficient than your opponent's, and in the long run, that's going to make you win the game. Second, we have board control, which is when you're in control of the game. In Hearthstone and Parallel, you can choose which creature your creature will attack, and the damage stays, right? So that helps you a lot because sometimes you can kill, like 2/2 has creatures, like I mentioned, with a 2/3 creature, which isn't even that much better. And usually this is very important in matchups against aggro and midrange, okay? Whether it's aggro versus aggro or aggro versus midrange, board control is really relevant. Against controlled decks, they usually have ways to kill a lot of creatures with just a few cards. So even though board control is still relevant, it's less important, okay? So, in an aggro deck mirror match, the best thing you can do isn't to attack your opponent's face as fast as possible, but rather to make more efficient trades on the board. Have your 2/3 attack your opponent's 2/2, then trade with another 3/2, something like that, or play creatures that will help you with that. Defender, for example, is a mechanic that really helps you do this. Because if you have a defender, and you try to be greedy with that trade, you're 2/3 against a 2/2 and then manage to trade with another creature. If you have a defender, you can make sure that their 1/1 won't be able to attack yours for an efficient trade, right? So, board control is basically about being able to maintain control of the board for longer, and that usually means you're able to make more efficient trades, okay? The concept of tempo, Basically, which I'm going to try to talk about here, tempo is more than just that, okay? But it's about giving up certain things to gain something else. Basically, it's about temporal preference. For example, oh, I can play 2 1-cost creatures now, or I can play a 2-cost creature. If you notice, a 1-cost creature is a 2 halves for 1 mana, and a 2-cost creature is a 2/3 for 2 mana. So, if you play 2 1-cost creatures, both 2 halves, you're putting more power on the board, right? You're putting out 4 power and 4 toughness, but you're using up more cards to do it. You're losing cards for that. This way you are saving time, but losing vintage cards. See what I mean? This is a strategy that's sometimes important. Aggro decks tend to do this a lot. They give a card advantage to gain tempo. Having tempo basically means setting the pace of the game. When you play 2 1-cost creatures instead of a single 2-cost creature, you're basically telling your opponent, look, if you don't deal with this, you're screwed. You're going to be taking 4 damage every turn. But if you had played the 2-cost creature, a 2/3, you'd only be hitting for 2. The pressure you're putting on them is less, you know? Let's move on to the next one, which is mana advantage. What is mana advantage? If in a game you play a 1-cost card on turn 1, a 2-cost card on turn 2, a 3-cost card on turn 3, and a 4-cost card on turn 4, you're getting the maximum value out of what you have available to you, which is using all the mana you have. If your opponent does nothing on turn 1, plays a 2-cost card on turn 2, a 1-cost card on turn 3 and passes, and then on turn 4 plays a 3-cost card, they won't have as much power on the board as you do if you're able to use your cards with the highest amount of mana possible, okay? It's simple, for the reason I just mentioned. The amount of value you're putting on the board is closely related to the mana cost of the card you're playing and the number of cards. So, being able to use your mana as efficiently as possible will usually give you more value on the board at that moment, immediately. But in the long run, it also lets you get more value out of your turns. Like, if you just keep playing cards each turn and being more mana efficient, it's much less likely that you'll get run over compared to if you're like, dang, I want to save this 1-cost card for turn 4 because it'll be stronger then, you know? Like, saving the relic, the guy who needs a relic to become a 3/2 in Finno's deck, you know, waiting for the 3-cost relic so you can play both together, you know? For example, I'm not saying it's always the wrong play to do that, but there will be situations where it's not a good idea. These are the most important concepts, basically. In the gameplay videos, I'll be able to demonstrate this more clearly in practice, but it's important for you to understand a bit of the theory. Yeah, what I'm saying is, this was learned over decades, so don't assume. Like, I don't know your level of experience, but don't assume you'll come out of this video understanding everything. Sometimes you might want to come back, watch again, and understand more, or go deeper by looking up an article from another card game, whatever works for you. And that's it, guys. I hope this helped you understand the concepts I'll be talking about in the videos, and so you can pay attention if you're going to play. Alright? Thanks, take care, and check out the videos I made about the deck creators. That's it, see you.